This week we're going to hear about party politics. We've heard an introduction to this subject last term, but what we're going to hear about today is a more in-depth and sort of developed understanding of what is obviously a very important element in the British political system, to it the make-up, the operation, the underlying theory about the British political party system, something which evolved in the 19th century but is now in a very late developed version of itself, as I'm sure Patrick Dunleavy is about to tell us. Patrick is the Professor of Political Science and Public Policy here at the LSE. He'll talk, as ever, for about an hour, but is happy if you want to intervene, ask questions as we go along, then we'll have the usual opportunity for a discussion, some more questions at the end. Patrick.
Thank you very much, Tony. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come, and I'm looking forward to doing these two sessions. And essentially, they're both about the UK party system, and this week is really about the electoral dimensions, and next week I'm going to be talking about ideology, strategy, policy, and governance type aspects. So what is a party system? Now, there's a huge literature which verges into the metaphysical points about how you define a party system. But essentially, we could think of it as having three aspects. And two of these highlighted in sort of red are the ones I'm going to talk about today. How voters behave, three of these. Electoral institutions that help structure the party system and particularly advantage some parties and disadvantage others. And a little bit about party ideologies. I shan't go very much into that this week. And then next week I'll be talking about governance institutions that favour in a very systematic way some parties over others, the extent to which parties continue to play a role in recruiting elites to government office and to senior political positions, how they behave in office and in opposition, and how much nowadays political parties really influence public policy making. So we're particularly thinking about the electoral dimension this week, and then the governance and policy and implications next week. Now, you can't think about elections without numbers. So if anybody here is kind of averse to numbers and doesn't like looking at charts, probably this is the time to exit speedily over there, because I'm going to throw a lot of charts and so on at you. It would help me a great deal if anybody who's not following something, doesn't understand what a chart is showing and so forth, sort of raises their hand at the time and asks me questions. On the other hand, if you think I don't understand my charts, we can leave that to the questions at the end, all right? So we really have to think about parties and party systems in quantitative terms and in terms of what is actually happening. But not very hard numbers, just very easy to look at charts. So I want to really convince you of 6 key propositions. The first one is that those of you who still believe Britain is a two-party system are living in a time warp. Those of you who say, well, it's almost like a two-party system but not quite, are living in a time warp. In fact, anybody who doesn't recognize that Britain is a standard European-style multi-party system now is really out of touch, or is a prisoner of some kind of systemic bias that our press and our parties, our top two parties particularly, have tended to encourage. So not only is it pretty much a standard European multi-party system now, but it's been that way for quite a long time. Britain hasn't been a two-party system since at least 1974, which is, 40 years ago. It hasn't been a 2.5 party or 3 party or any other kind of thing other than a multi-party system since, in the 21st century, that's for sure. So you just need to kind of think about that in terms of what do voters want? Who are voters voting for? They're not voting for a 2 or a 3 or anything else other than a multi-party system. The problem that we have is that we have a severely distorting electoral system. Now, if you've grown up with this system, you probably think it as natural as sliced bread. If you've come from the USA, you probably think it's the way that the whole world should be run. Most US people do. But it is actually a severely distorting electoral system, and one of its key distortions is to suppress what voters, the views that voters want to suppress in some particular context, particularly general elections. So those are the first three propositions I want to sell you. Moving on to the second three, some of you will probably have heard of a great mythological law of political science called Diversion's law, which essentially says that plurality rule voting systems, such as the one we have in the UK, always and everywhere tend to generate two-party systems. And this is so completely unfounded that I'm just going to try and take you through why it's unfounded. If you go and look on Google and chase down how many references there are to Diversion's law, it just keeps going and going and going. It's hundreds of thousands. There's a whole electoral field called electoral systems, which is almost completely founded around this law, and an associated proposition which says that PR systems encourage multipartism. Now, there's no evidence, no scientifically credible evidence that this is true, and particularly it's not true in the British case and in countries like Britain. I want to introduce you quickly to an alternative theory, which is more of a rational choice theory, from two American professors called Dixon and Sheave, and they give you a pretty strong rational actor basis for why the Diversion's law is not going to work, and why, in fact, the more you have a mature and a modern democratic system, the more you will tend towards, in a linear way, towards more multipartism. And that certainly is true of the UK. And so finally, I want to suggest to you that Britain's party system is continuing to evolve. I'll be discussing this next week, particularly when we focus on coalition government. We are in the fourth year of a stable peacetime coalition government, which previously we had not had since the 1930s. And many expectations of how coalition governments would work have been confounded by this experience. And so we need to, it's quite likely that the next election may also produce a hung parliament and another coalition government. So I think we need to think about these developments in the context of what voters have been doing and what voters have been signaling to political elites for the last 30 years, and which political elites have been doing their best to ignore or to pretend was signaling something else. So those are the 6 key propositions for this week, and I'll do it in 2 halves. The first thing to think about is, well, let's think of a picture of the British party system. And this is what it looks like at the moment. We've got a left-right line here, a spectrum. We've got 2 big parties, Labour and the Conservatives. We've got the Liberal Democrats, who are of course partners in government at the moment, not doing terribly well in the polls, so shrunken a little bit from the former glory. And we have a larger and at the moment surging kind of alternative right-wing party, UK Independence Party, which creates an immediate structural problem for the Conservatives, that they have enemies on the right and enemies on the left, and they can't easily cope with them. We used to have a party called the British National Party, which at various times has done quite well, and at various times has split, usually on the basis that some leader or other is a homosexual and they can't tolerate that. Thankfully, they keep splitting and so on. So they're not, at the moment, a credible force, although they're still running about 3% in some elections. On the left of Labour is where we're a bit different from the rest of Europe, because the Greens in the UK have been around for a long time. At various points they got up to 15% in one European Parliament election, but they have really sort of failed to break through. However, they are a party that has a lot of representatives, and they have an MP in Parliament. In fact, all the underlying parties here have MPs in Parliament. Ukip, obviously not. And then there's George Galloway representing Respect, yet another of the many manifestations of left of Labour groupuscles that have come and gone in an effort to create a left of Labour force, which has generally failed. And if we go to other countries like Scandinavia, we'll find left of Social Democrat parties, but not in the UK. That's the main difference, the absence of something very large or credible to the left of Labour. But of course there are other party systems in the UK, not just England. We were looking at England, but if we look at Scotland, we have a completely different left-orientated party system with the SNP and Labour. It's tricky to decide who's left of which. But the SNP, of course, is running the Scottish government now, and for many Scottish people, the Scottish government is a more important and more present, more important element of their lives than what's happening remotely down in Westminster. And we see, you know, a pretty shrunken Liberal Democrats, pretty shrunken Conservatives, not very successful Ukip, but still something like a 4 and a bit party system. And if we drew the map for Wales, we'd see the same thing with Plaid Cymru. And of course, if we went to Northern Ireland, we'd see a wholly different party system structured on completely different, not really left-right lines. I'm not going to talk about Northern Ireland in the rest of the presentation, but we could certainly discuss it. Okay, so it's important to think that this party system has changed a lot. If we went back to 2010, at the time of the general election, it was quite unclear, really, whether the Liberal Democrats were more left than Labour. Labour was pretty conservative by that stage, very centrist. Liberal Democrats, to many voters in 2010, were seen as a more sort of centre-left alternative to Labour. And of course, the SNP has flourished recently, but hasn't always been there. So we've got changes. If we look at the main shares of the parties over the last 3 general elections and right up to the present, to today's polling average in UK Polling Report, which is a great site. If you haven't visited it before, it's the one to visit. You can see there's a certain continuity in the Conservative performance over the last 15 years, really. It's lurked around the low 30s, popped up to 37% in 2010, but hasn't really ever been very consistently there. Labour's pretty much grounded in the high 30s. It depressed its score quite considerably in 2010 because of the economic crisis and because of Gordon Brown's perceived failure as a Prime Minister, but it's been, you know, structurally pretty solid since. The Liberal Democrats were typically in the high teens. They've run at 23.5% in the last couple of general elections, and now they'll be lucky to get, you know, half that at the next general election, partly because a lot of left of centre voters were disillusioned by their coalition deal with the Conservatives. And we've got a generally rising tide of other party support, and the key one at the moment, of course, is Ukip. So you can see they're actually the 3rd ranked party at the moment in the polls. And if we run up to the to the European election in May, they may get, well, current polls suggest 27%. So this is not a niche party; it's quite an important party. Okay, so moving on, if we just look at the more detailed results, it's worth noting that in general election terms, Ukip has never done very well. 3.2% was a particularly low score. I think they're likely to score around about 8% in the next general election. So there'll be a very significant loss of support, mainly hitting the Conservatives, although they do draw support from other parties as well. The British National Party, as you can see, still had a couple of percent. Then we can see the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru, the nationalist parties in their countries, of course much bigger vote shares than in their countries than these results suggest, and the Greens. So it's quite a diverse set of parties that we have represented, and it's important to notice that a lot of these parties have official elected representatives in things other than the House of Commons. So the Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat are present in all forums. The UK Independence Party has yet to make it into the Commons. They've got a few peers. I don't really count peers because they're not elected. They're in the European Parliament, the Greater London Assembly. They did incredibly well in a breakthrough mode in local government last year in the local elections. They're likely to do very well in local government elections this year because of the Euro surge. So that will be 2 years in a row that they are really beginning to sort of create a local institutional base. And, you know, even the BNP in the past has had European Parliament, GLA, and local government people. Of course, the Greens are in Parliament now, too. So what we've been looking, what's produced this current position is a decline of the Conservative and Labour predominance that was there in the 1950s. So at that time, you would see that 95% of the votes would go to the two main parties, top parties, and that 95% of the conflict, of the contests, if you went to each local seat, 95% of them had Tory and Labour in the top two positions. Now you can see that both these measures have dropped a lot up to 2005, and in 1983 the proportion of seats which were where Conservative and Labour were the top two fell radically, but Labour subsequently recovered, and the Social Democratic and Liberal Alliance failed to develop. So this is a long-run structural thing that we can measure in lots of different ways. This is another version of the same thing. The purple line shows you the two-party share of the vote. The grey line shows you the extent to which the two parties are leading the other parties. So, and these numbers here, sadly misplaced, actually chart that decline. So in 1950s, 80% lead over other parties, now down to a 30% lead. This orange thing shows you the scale of the Liberal Democrat vote, and the yellow one shows you the votes for other parties. So there have been ups and downs, and there still may be little bumps in the future, but this is a long-run structural systemic trend, however we look at it. Now, a lot of people think the foundation of the two-party system is class voting, that middle-class people vote Conservative, working-class people vote Labour, and thus it's very difficult for people like the Liberal Democrats and other parties to get in on the act. There has in fact been a process of class de-alignment going on for a long time. It's been officially denied by successive ESRC-funded election studies, but this is the 2010 class breakdown of support. So if we look at the classes, how did they vote between the Conservatives? The upper non-manual group and the routine non-manual group and the skilled manual group essentially voted identically for the Conservatives, pretty much in line with the national average. The unskilled manual group and the slightly not working residual pensioner kind of group that opinion polls create was a little bit down. Meanwhile, the same pattern is true for Labour. There wasn't really very much variation here. There was stronger Labour voting in the DE group. And for the Liberal Democrats, weaker voting in the DE group, but pretty similar across the other groups. So class de-alignment means that the sort of traditional social insulation that created very safe Labour areas, very safe Conservative areas, hasn't gone away because we've got a lot of agglomeration of people into intense, intensely middle class or intensely working class areas. But it's not socially based, the two-party system, anymore in class voting. There is a lot of different cleavages. The ones that traditionally used to dominate in the period through to the mid-1990s was much more a sort of trade union, public sector versus private sector cleavage. That's still there. But the emerging cleavage, the one that the Conservatives are playing really for all their worth in the current government, is the hard-working, good-natured, deserving people who are their supporters, and the sort of stigmatized benefit street people who are the core Labour supporters. So that's the image that they would like to project, and of course Labour is desperately trying to avoid being stuck with this image.
Squeezed middle.
Yes, squeezed middle, so they're trying to rebuild, especially support amongst the public sector who haven't had any pay rises for 4 or 5 years. So there's a contest between the parties. It's not really strictly anymore about class. So let me just stop there and see if anybody's got any queries, questions, or problems so far before I discuss the key reasons, which are not to do with class voting, why this thing. Yeah.
The question was, is the decline in the Conservative plus Labour vote in any sense linked to, is it as a result of or linked to the decline in turnout?
And the answer is no, because these are proportions of votes cast, not related to turnout. The problem that the Conservatives and Labour tend to have is that their supporters get a little bit less keen when they are in government, and whichever is the opposition parties, their supporters get a good deal keener. So that tends to be the effect that influences turnout. But we haven't got any turnout factors in here. Right. Well, let's move on to institutional factors that support the top two parties, and largely support the top two parties, whatever it is that voters are trying to do. And the first thing is that the British party system is very disproportional. Now, we use a measure called deviation from proportionality, which I'm going to explain in the steadfast knowledge that you're all going to go away and download the slides and bone up on this and think about it. Okay, so all we do is we look at the seats versus votes shares. So the Conservatives have got, in this example, 35% of the votes, 45% of the seats. So they have a positive deviation of plus 10. In this example, Labour's got 30 on votes, 38% of seats, so it's got a positive deviation of 8. Now, when you have positive deviations, you must have negative deviations. So if some parties are overrepresented, others have to be underrepresented. So we get underrepresentation. Historically, for example, this isn't too unlikely. The Liberal Democrats would get 20% of the votes and 7% of the seats, so they'd be significantly underrepresented. Now, if we just added up positive and negative numbers, they would come to 0. So we don't do that. We add up positive and negative numbers as if they're all positive, and then we divide by 2. Okay, and that gives us a measure called deviation from proportionality. The higher this is, the worse your voting system is in terms of faithfully reproducing in seats terms what voters have voted for. All right? You can also think of the deviation from proportionality as being the proportion of MPs in Parliament who shouldn't be there, given their party's national share of the vote. Now, it's not actually possible to get to, the minimum score is 0. Actually, it's very hard to get below 4%. So you could think of 0 to 4% is probably not attainable. But a decent electoral system, a decent, well-run polity will give you, something of the order of 4 to 10%. That would be fine. And actually, if you look at, for example, the USA, regularly using plurality rule where there are only 2 parties, that actually produces deviations from proportionality of 7 or 8%, which is very creditable. And in the UK, the figures at general elections are much higher. So these are the general elections thing. The last one, 2010, the figure was 22.7%. In other words, the electoral system effectively took a quarter of the votes, scrumpled them up, threw them away, and gave those seats to somebody who wasn't entitled to those seats in terms of their national share of the vote. Now, we may want to defend that, but that's essentially what the system is doing, and it does it very consistently. So the proportion was 21% in 2005, it was 22% in 2001, 21% in 1997, 17% in 1992. So basically, the British voting system is highly disproportional. I could show you some other measures of disproportionality where, on a regional local basis, where the DV scores can get up to 70% of what a liberal democracy could do. Now, the thing is, what would happen if we didn't have quite such a disproportional system? And we've got a good answer because we've got all these other kinds of voting systems going on. So we have the Scotland, Wales and London using what are called British AMS systems, additional member systems, which are essentially proportional, broadly proportional systems. And we also use list voting, which is a direct proportional system in the European Parliament elections. So if we pop those up, we can see that on the whole, the level of voting DV is less. It's nothing like as bad as the general election, but it's not perfect. And some of the big results are in Wales, which has a slightly, these 15s and 14s and so on, in Wales. But basically we're getting 10 or 11% in London and Scotland and in the European Parliament elections. So these are not perfect by any means. They're certainly not highly proportional elections. They don't get anywhere near the 4% level. But if we compare the difference between 4% and these results, it's a moderate degree of disproportionality compared with the general election results.
Can I just say it's interesting to note that we have managed the 1992 election under first past the post appears to have performed slightly better than this election under
this is Wales.
The
Wales system is highly rigged in Labour's favour by the Labour Party when they implemented it, and a consummate piece of electoral engineering it was. So we, essentially the Welsh thing has a very small proportion of PR and a large proportion of constituency results. But you can see that even if we look at the European election, which uses a list PR system, the particular version that we have in the UK is quite, weighted towards the larger parties in its effect and discriminates against small parties. So the first thing to think about is we don't have a fair voting system, and that has very systemic effects on how voters behave. And I'm going to show you the effects by looking at another measure, which I'm going to introduce to you now, which is called the effective number of parties. Now, not all parties are the same size, so we need a weighting, a way of computing how many parties there really are. And the effective number of parties is not by any means ideal. There are various things wrong with it, but it's the one that everybody uses and the one that we're familiar with. And it looks complicated, but it's actually very simple. So I'll again explain it in the confident knowledge that you'll go away and practice with this, so you'll become red hot with the effective number of parties. So what we do is we take the vote share and we express it as a decimal point thing. So 38% is 0.38. And then we square it. We do that for all the parties in turn. And then we add up these squared amounts. So in this particular case, you can see that the squared amounts come to 0.312. And then we divide 1 by this squared amount, and we get a number for the effective number of parties. And this number is weighted towards the largest parties, so it tends to give a lot of influence to the largest party scores and tends to minimize the influence of the smaller parties on the result. So it's quite a conservative estimate of the number of parties, the real or effective number of parties that we have in a competition. Okay, so you're probably thinking, how does that work in actual elections? And if we look at the general elections, the plurality rule general elections, again shown in red, you can see that the effective number of parties is around about 3, just growing noticeably in the last couple of elections. It's been around that number for quite a long time. You could get back to 1974 and find results that are around about 3. So that's how people behave when they know that they're voting for Westminster elections, when they know they're voting in a plurality rule system that is going to chew up quite a large proportion of their votes and not accord any seats. So what happens when they vote under the British style proportional systems? And these are the elections that are taking place very regularly now in London, Scotland and Wales, using this system called British AMS. And you can see that the number of parties that people are voting for is much higher in proportional elections. So we look at the period between 2005 and 2010, 4.5 parties in every election, then if we look since 2010, we see a bit of a reduction in London, a bit of a conservative fight back there. But in Scotland, we have 3.5 parties because the Scottish National Party has done really well and the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives have been sort of reduced. So even the 3.5 here doesn't give you a complete picture. And then finally we can add in the European Parliament elections, and you can see that the number of parties that people are voting for is much greater here. The last one, 2009, the score was 6.3 parties, as almost double the number of in the general election. And what this graph shows you is that when British voters know that they're dealing with a system that is going to handle their votes fairly, they behave in systematically different ways. And they vote for more parties. And they particularly vote for anti-European parties in European Parliament elections. So Ukip and the BNP have had nearly a quarter of the votes for the last 2 European Parliament elections, but of course not one single MP amongst them. And they're likely, Ukip is likely to get something like 27%, the BNP will probably get another 3%, so approximately, 1 in 3 British voters may support parties to the right of the Conservatives.
The locals and Euros this year.
In the Euro elections, that's what the current polling intentions are showing. So there's a very clear relationship between the system used to count votes and the way in which people behave, and we can think about other possible interpretations of this. The predominant one that sadly prevails amongst my colleagues in political science is the idea of second-order elections. And what this says is voters have first-order elections, like general elections, and then they have second-order elections, which they don't take as seriously, and then they think, oh, well, it's not really a serious election, so let's vote for Nigel Farage, or something like that. That's the argument. I think this is just contemptuous of voters. Voters behave, they vote for who they want to vote for, and what we've got here is pretty much a clear evidence of suppression of voting, not second-order elections. But we could discuss the differences between them. Well, that brings me on to my final point, which is about Diversion's law, and the modernisation of party systems. And so this is really where we're thinking, how do we locate the British experience and the wider experience of other countries? Let's just see, I've spelt diversion completely wrongly. So I have to modify these things. Now it's spelt right. So essentially Diversion's law says plurality rule elections always directly produce or at least tend to strongly encourage the emergence of a two-party system. And he had a subsidiary thing called the hypothesis, which said that when you have PR systems, that actively encourages multi-partism. Now, initially this was proclaimed in the 1950s by Maurice Diversion, a very distinguished and very clever French political scientist. And initially it was framed at the national level, and it seemed to fit a large number of countries: Britain, USA, Canada, Australia, and other kinds of countries. But over the years, outside of the USA, the share of the vote going to the top two parties has been falling in almost all of the Westminster system countries. And in India, there are now 43 parties represented in Parliament, even though it is the biggest polity in the world, using plurality rule voting. So defenders of this law have progressively reframed it to say, no, it doesn't really apply at the national level. It really just applies at the local level. And so national level data, the fact that you have regional parties or like the Scottish National Party or the Welsh National Party, isn't really a contradiction to Diversion's law. And so the most recent sort of current reformulation of this law is by an American political scientist called Andrew Cox. And it basically says, in plurality rule elections, there should be an evident tendency for the number of parties per district to converge on the district magnitude plus one. And the district magnitude is how many MPs you elect. We only elect one MP, so 1 plus 1 is 2. So it's just basically reframing Diversion's law for the local level. It means that we have to look at local level patterns, not just the national vote shares that we've been thinking about so far. So that's really what I'm just going to do here. But before we do, we might just think about the Diversion had two sort of subcomponents which you probably all heard before, but I'll just mention them. One says, well, why does this tendency happen? Because political elites won't stand if they know that there's going to be a two-party predominance, if they know that only the top two parties are going to have a chance of winning under the plurality rule election system. And so that's the sort of mechanical effect. The elites don't come forward and offer themselves, they just join one of the two main parties. The other effect is a sort of psychological effect. Voters who vote for parties other than the two main parties and find that the electoral system scrumples at their votes and throws them in a wastepaper basket become disillusioned, and you don't carry on doing something that you don't get any return for, where you can't seem to be making a difference, and therefore you just stop. And we may have a succession of short-lived challenges to the top two parties, but this disappointment effect will periodically operate. Now the alternative view, which I think I've mentioned, is down to two political scientists called Dixon and Sheave, says if you're a large-scale social group, let's say you are in the large majority in a local constituency, you've got more than 67% of the votes, then however you split, you're going to have more than the opposition party, right? So if you've got 70% of the vote, you divide, even if you divide it exactly equally, you'll both get 35% and you'll beat the opposition because they've only got 30%, right? So we should see that in constituencies with very pronounced majorities, these majorities over time will split. And the reason is that the majority of the majority largest group within the majority, can make their welfare better by having an MP who is closer to their ideological position. So instead of having an MP who's catering for the whole 70%, we just have, for example, supposing we have an anti-European majority amongst the conservative voters, then they might like to have a anti-European MP. And so we'll tend to see that all the big majorities will be eliminated over time. So we shouldn't see any constituencies with more than 2/3 of the vote going to one party. And that will tend to have effects in terms of increasing the number of parties. So the more modern and the more mature a political system is, the longer it's been in operation, the more we will expect to see an increase in party fragmentation. So the question is, how do we measure that? Well, let's just compare the UK with a couple of other countries to begin with and think, well, how many single-party seats or two-party seats do we see in the UK, or seats now with only 3 parties competing? And the answer is hardly any. So almost every British constituency, 96.5% of them have 4 or more parties competing. Now, that's not true in the USA. You can find nearly 3 out of 5 constituencies in the US House of Representatives where there's either 2 parties only, Republican and Democrats, or even just one party because the other major party doesn't think it's even worthwhile standing and losing money trying to beat them. But if we look at India, which is also a plurality rule system, again, we don't see very many seats with less than 4 parties. And you can see that the British system has the highest proportion of parties concentrated at 5 or more parties. So 2/5 of British constituencies in 2005 have 5 or more parties contesting. So that sort of tends to suggest that the elite mechanical bit of Diversion's law isn't working at all well in India or the UK, still going strong in the USA. But how do voters behave? Do they support these 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th parties, or do they stay locked into the top 2 parties? And we need to look at that now at the district level. So in order to do that, I have a very complicated graph, which is just going to explain to you very simply. We put whichever are the top 2 parties on the bottom axis, and so we have one party ahead of the other, and then we have the second party being ahead of the first party. In some districts we'll find that. And then on the vertical axis we put the vote share for all the other parties. That gives us a big triangle. And the thing that we're interested in is how much of the seats are in these areas, these blue and red shaded areas, or whatever it may be, where the party is winning a local majority of seats. It's one thing that we want to think about. And then the other thing we want to think about, because of the Dixon and Sheave prediction, is how many of these seats have got more than 67% of the vote going to one party? Because if Dixon and Sheave are right, there shouldn't be any seats with more than 67% of the vote. Right? And then the other thing we're thinking about is where do the mass of seats sit? Do they lurk down the bottom because it's a 2-party system? Or is the third party share of the vote higher? Or is it very high indeed? Well, the question you might want to think is, give me a counterpoint. So I'm going to look first at the USA. This is a classic, perfect, one might say extreme 2-party system. You can't see all that many dots here because they're all on the bottom axis. All very, very close to the bottom axis. In other words, there are either areas where the Republicans are well ahead or areas where the Democrats are well ahead. There's just a tiny set of seats here where neither party is winning a majority. There are very few seats off this line. These ones over here are, the Republicans refusing to stand against incumbent Democrats. And these ones over here are Republicans refusing to lose money. This is Democrats refusing to stand against Republicans, and this is Republicans refusing to stand against incumbent Democrats. And the only other things that you see are usually somebody's been turned down by their party at a primary and they're running against their own party, but they're previously the incumbent. And that is a perfect two-party system. If you're anything like that, you're definitely justified in saying Diversion's law is working. And it does work, but it only works in one country, which is the USA.
Now just to explain the 67% line here,
Yeah.
you're saying that there are places, particularly where
Yeah.
Democrats are ahead of Republicans.
Well, there's a whole mass of them over here, and then a slightly
Smaller
less
number.
large, but still, there's lots of them piled up behind these things. There's so many that they're all concentrated, we can't really show them. But there are hundreds on the bottom line with just two parties competing.
But they're getting over 67% of the vote.
Yes, and they're clearly, so Dixon and Sheave is not working.
It's not working in America at all.
In America.
Right,
No,
okay.
It's completely wrong. For America, and Diversion is completely right. Okay? But that's just one country. I mean, you can't have a law based on one country. So the question is, what about Britain in the two-party heyday back in the 1950s? What does our chart look like then? Well, there was, a basis for thinking that there were a lot of two-party seats here. There were a lot of things down on the vertical axis with just two-party competition. There were a minority of seats where the Liberals were still contesting against Conservatives or Labour, but the vast majority of MPs in 1955 were elected with a local majority in their constituency. So it wasn't just that they had more votes than anybody else, they had more than half the share of the votes. So everything in the red area were Labour seats with a majority, everything in the blue area were Conservative seats with a majority, and most of these other ones are Liberal Democrat contenders. There were a few Scottish nationalists, and so on.
And that one right at the top there is an uncontested non-Conservative or Labour seat, is it, or something?
It is, but who is the incumbent?
1955. Joe Grimmond? I don't
Somebody
know.
against whom...
Winston Churchill.
It's actually the Speaker's
The
seat.
Speaker.
The Speaker is counted as
Down.
not in one
Right,
of the...
very good.
Yeah, a little trick there. Okay, so that's 1955. What about now? Well, 2005, very different pattern. You can see there's absolutely nothing down here on the floor at all. It's just gone away completely. There's nowhere really in the country with less than about 15% of the vote share going to third or fourth parties. The whole distribution has shifted right up off the bottom axis. Actually, something like a third of this whole triangle is now more or less blank. Notice that almost nobody's got 67% majorities. And there's a huge swathe of MPs in this white area who don't have a local majority. It's tricky to say how many of the third party seats, Scottish National and Welsh National and Liberal Democrats, have a majority from here, but we could just think it would probably be somewhere above the 60% line. So if you look at the difference between those, there we had huge mass of seats down here, virtually all seats, just really not very many seats. You could count them less than 20 maybe, where the local MP didn't have a majority, and now the vast majority are in that white zone. That's 2005. You might say it was a special election because of the Iraq War and disillusionment with Labour and so on, but this is 2010, pretty much the same pattern. It's just shifted more to the right, and we don't see anything in the bottom sort of third of the figure, and we see very few, if any, 67%. So that's a very useful indication that diversion law is not working in Britain. I can show you that at the regional level if you're interested. You can see that the southeast is very Conservative aligned, the northwest is much more Labour in 2010, The Scottish National Party is, very active in Scotland and Welsh in Wales, and so on. And if you look at European Parliament elections, just look at the regional positions of the vote shares here, starting off in 1999 with the green dots, then moving in 2004 to the brown squares, and then moving in 2009 to the blue diamonds. You can see that we've moved really fully into this area, which is called the crown, because it looks vaguely like a crown, where this would be about the maximum that you'd expect to see for a European multi-party system. So in European Parliament terms, we're already there. And I just thought I'd leave you with one last little slide that shows patterns in India, which again is the biggest multi-party system in the plurality rule system in the world. And you still have, these are actually showing blocks, so they're not really showing parties. So there's a BJP block, the sort of more Indian nationalist block, with several dozen parties in that. Congress block with around about 20 parties in that. But even if you look on a block basis, it's perfectly clear that there's only really a minority of Indian seats that are anything like a two-block contest. And then we have this huge mass of other seats, sort of a mushroom cloud, where third and fourth and fifth parties are winning large numbers of seats. So we could discuss other evidence, but for me, it's pretty clear that Diversion's law doesn't work, hasn't worked for a long time in the UK, and is really pretty much now confined to the US. And that the Dixon-Nashev prediction is broadly right. So basically next week I'll be tracing some of the implications of this for how the party system itself works in terms of governing Britain, ideology, strategy and policy making, but that's for next week. So,
okay, Patrick, thank you very much. Now, perhaps I could just start off with a question. I mean, you've made, I think, what for defenders of the first past the post system, voting system, would be observations which you could challenge. You could challenge by effectively saying that people within those systems understand that they are operating within the system, voting system they're operating within, and therefore begin to behave, and certainly as they become more educated about how, for example, they can vote tactically, that allows them to get results with one electoral system that begin to resemble those of a PR or a different electoral system. And how do the theories cope with the different theories cope with the fact that voters can begin to use one system to start to achieve results that you'd normally see from the other?
Right. Well, there is an explanation. If you look at, let's say, American political science explanations, they tend to say that what goes on when you have different electoral systems operating at the same time is a thing that they call contagion effects. So the idea is you have the sort of pure milk of plurality rule voting, but then something happens, like you have state level elections or you have a different electoral system in the UK, and then people get used to behaving differently in the state elections or in this PR election. And then gradually this contaminates the sort of support and the patterns of behavior that were appropriate for the main electoral system. That would be the way that they would represent it. So you could see that when Tony Blair, who was largely responsible for the introduction of the London, Scotland and Wales systems and the
you were
European.
responsible for the London system, Patrick.
Well, I designed the London system, but which is a very good system, I think. But I would think that.
You would say that.
Yes. I think at the time the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats had a pact going on, which was a very effective constitutional pact and reaped some huge constitutional changes. If you look in Tony Blair's memoirs, he's contemptuous of some of the best things he ever did. And he certainly doesn't seem to have thought through any of the logic of it. It just was a tactically convenient thing to do. He would do it. And he probably does think of this as contagion, as do sort of quite a lot of people in the Tory and Labour parties.
But going beyond I get the contagion I can see, but what about where, let's assume there's no contagion, but that you are in a constituency where it's a Conservative Labour seat, this has happened in lots of places, and the dear Lib Dems came along, as they used to, and said, the only way to get X out is to vote for us.
Yeah.
That's a slightly different, not a contagion issue, but a classic Lib Dem, now I suspect possibly it will be used by Ukip argument, which is to effectively to subvert the normal operation of one system to get something towards the result of the other.
Yes, well, voters have been very effective in that way, particularly if you think, let's supposing we think about we're just counting voters up here and we've got right-wing voters over here and left-wing voters over here. Supposing we have a Conservative safe seat where, so the voter curve is like this. There's the median voter is over here and is pretty well safe for the Conservatives. Meanwhile, the Labour Party's over here, and election after election, the results would come in and they'd get that, and the Liberals would get that. And then this would be blue, and this would be red. So the Liberals actually owe their current success to their ability to say to voters, not really tactical voters in the normal sense, but voters who are behaving tactically in the long run, why don't you stop voting Labour because they can never win? We can push this boundary over here, and if some of you guys come on board, we've got this and we can beat the incumbents. But that's the thing that's a learning curve that takes place over a long series of elections. Doesn't happen overnight, and takes place in particular regions, started in the southwest, for example, in England, and Scotland and Wales and so on.
Okay, all right, let's open it up. Now, Francesca, Josh, you've had questions. Which of you wants to go first? Francesca, Josh.
Well, Tony, you kind of stole the first part.
I'm sorry.
But I can still ask the second part. So you talked about this contagion effect.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about kind of the European elections in 2009. Ukip did, reasonably well.
Yeah.
And then you've had local elections since then.
Yeah.
Last year, they really broke through.
Yeah.
And I wonder. Firstly, I was going to ask about the interaction between those electoral systems and those party systems, and how that works. You kind of explain that. But I wonder, after the supposed referendum in 2017, say Britain votes to leave the EU, we no longer have this party list electoral system that UKIP and BNP and other smaller parties can do well in. So I wonder whether you think that would kind of limit this contagion effect that you've talked about.
No, because if you look at the comparison between the the voting patterns, effective number of parties, it is a bit higher in the European Parliament elections, right? But it's not massively, out of tune with, let's say, if you compared this one, which is London, with that one, which is Europe. They're pretty much the same. So I think even under British-style AMS systems, even if we left Europe, I don't think the European Parliament thing is the main driver. I think it's the British AMS systems.
But even in terms of UKIP's prospects, if we were just to look at them as a...
Well, if we've left Europe, they've won the referendum, they'll be heading for Downing Street, one imagines. And good luck to them.
But I suppose what your point is, though, I mean, and in fact, Nigel Farage, who was speaking at the LSE a week ago, made the point himself that the PR voting system inside the European, or for the European Parliament and European elections, as it were, paradoxically has helped, I think that's not misquoting him, helped Ukip to get a toehold. And I mean, there is the paradoxical possibility that, given that the European lines are the longest here, that if those elections disappeared, it's not necessarily it would feed through to all the other elections, but if there is the what's the word? Sorry again, the pollution.
Contagion
effect. That it could feed back against smaller parties. I mean, that's your point, isn't it? That paradoxically, for Ukip, it could actually undermine them. I mean,
well, I think these two results are, a little bit unusual, because there was not just a Ukip vote, but a very substantial BNP vote. Now, the BNP has sort of largely gone away, and Ukip is actually going to get, on the current, if we think about 2014, they'll probably get 27%, something like that. So actually we will collapse, this number of parties will collapse back towards 4, because we've no longer got, the BNP splitting the far right vote. So I think we might see quite a bit of a reduction without it really affecting the political system. I think that there are other things that we could think of. The London results, sadly, are not showing up here. Well, they're showing from time to time. I don't know why. But we've also got mayoral elections. We have mayoral elections in quite a lot of British cities. And these also use a system which allows people to express multiple preferences. And the evidence is that British voters love expressing multiple preferences. They want to express multiple preferences. A number of people who have just one party that they like, most people tend to have a couple of parties that they like. And if they have a voting system that allows them to express more than one preference, they will do it, but they're not allowed to do that in the Westminster elections.
It's worth noting that the London election results to which Patrick refers are available on the internet very easily in very small voting districts. They're counted electronically, and they're available at relatively local. I think they'd be available at ward level. They're relatively low, and you can then see quite closely where there is cross-voting, as between Conservative for Mayor, Labour for something else, Assembly, for example. You can see quite big differences showing up in the ward-by-ward behaviour of voters.
And these kind of elections where people can express multiple preferences are very easy. They're much easier for contenders to the established parties to enter. So you've got to remember, for example, in 2000, Ken Livingstone stood as an independent and won as London mayor with an organisation that consisted of about 30 people, a bus and a website, but beat the official Labour candidate into 4th place. So, these are very important differences in what they mean for the parties. I don't think, in the remote contingency that British voters do vote to withdraw from the EU, which I don't think they will, they've had two opportunities before in 1975 and 1983. Each time they looked as if they would until a few months before the vote, and then they chickened out. I confidently predict that's what they'll do if there's a 2017 referendum. But there'll only be a 2017 referendum if there's an outright Tory majority, and we're a long way off that on current poll showing. So I wouldn't get too worried about the loss of the EU votes.
Francesca.
Okay, so I was quite interested in the vocabulary kind of choices you make when you're speaking about these topics. So when you're talking about Wales, you're talking about the fact that Labour had used election engineering to advantage itself.
Yeah.
When you're talking about political scientists that still see, politics as a bipolar conflict, you say that they're contemptuous towards voters. So you obviously present it as a very kind of big problem, So obviously you're involved by helping design voting systems.
Yep.
How do you think these problems should be solved? Do you think they're going to be solved via political scientists or via parties motivating change?
Well, I mean, we've had an interesting development in 2011 where voters got the opportunity to vote on the adoption of the Australian alternative vote system. And they pretty emphatically rejected it because it was represented as being a kind of Liberal Democrat plot, and it was very associated with the Liberal Democrats, and they were very unpopular at the time.
Just for the purposes of those who won't remember, deconstruct briefly how the alternative vote would have worked compared with PR as most people will know it.
Yeah, well, basically AV works like this. You have a list of candidates, and you have and then you vote 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we count up the votes and eliminate the bottom candidate from the bottom, and so on. So that's the AV thing. Now, there was an alternative that Liberal Democrats could have used, and some of us spent a large amount of time talking to people like Lord Reynard and trying to persuade them to do the sensible thing. So the alternative would be, let's say, the London Mayor system, which is a thing called the supplementary vote. So you have all your candidates, and you have 2 columns for first preference and second preference. And then you vote by putting an X in the columns. And that is a simpler version of the Australian thing. It also has various other advantages. It guarantees that you can only win if you're in the top 2 in the first round of voting and so on.
That's a bit like the London Mayor vote, isn't it?
This
is the London Mayor system.
And also it's used very successfully in lots of other mayoral elections, and it was used very unsuccessfully in terms of turnout, at least in the police commissioner elections in 2012, but worked perfectly well there. So if you ask me how can things be improved, the answer is basically this system should be adopted for Westminster and for local authority elections in England and Wales. And I think that would be a viable thing to do. I think it would be possible for a Lib Lam coalition government to do it. And I think it would be, uncontroversial. And it would begin to allow people to express a little bit more preferences. You see, what's going wrong at the moment is we have definitely, for sure, 25% of the country who would like to, curtail foreign immigration, and a goodly proportion of them would like to leave the EU. And yet when we go into Parliament, they don't have a seat because their party hasn't got any seats. So that's a very sad and deleterious thing. I'm not in favour of us leaving the EU. It's not in my interest to advocate, giving Nigel Farage a block of common seats, but it's ridiculous to have a quarter of the electorate's views not being expressed in the Parliament, or being expressed via subterfuges and behind-the-scenes elite deals at the moment, which is what's happening with the Tory right wing. That leads to people holding the Parliament in contempt, in my view, because it's not reflecting the balance of opinion in the country. And it's not reflecting the balance of opinion in the country because the existing voting system is over-protecting the top 2 parties. Now, you might want to protect your top 2 parties or foster them in minor ways, but not at to the degree and extent to which is happening at the moment. That's what I would suggest. But that's a very controversial view, so you can...
Yes, well, you were quite rightly were picked up. It is a controversial view, and anybody want to pick up this point or others? Anybody like to ask?
By the way, what I was saying was that people who say, without any basis and without any evidence, oh, people voted differently in the European election, it must be a second-order election. I don't, that's contemptuous of voters. That, if people want to vote, it certainly doesn't make any sense to say that the Welsh or Scottish elections are second-order elections in their countries. These are, actually more important than the UK election.
And indeed, polling does suggest that local politicians, or at least all politicians other than Westminster one, I'm not sure about the European ones, but non-Westminster politicians are held in higher regard non-Westminster politicians in the UK are held in higher regard than Westminster politicians, whether that's fair or not, but that's what the polling shows. Yeah, please come on.
When you're
Joe.
doing the calculation on the effective number of electoral parties,
Yeah.
as I spent one very full evening last week doing for my dissertation.
Excellent. Well done. Everybody should count.
But one of the difficulties I encountered when looking at the data sets was the other category.
Yes.
In particular, I think when you calculated it, you kind of aggregated all the other parties.
You treated the other, I thought this, you treated the others as one party, didn't you?
Well,
Sort of.
You wouldn't do that. Actually, you have to treat them independently.
Yeah.
And the reason is because if you gather them together, then they'll skew the calculation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So 10 parties with 1% of the vote each is a lot more fragmented than one party with 10% of the vote. So you know, and in Britain we're so biased in the way we process elections that we will regularly publish election results which are not full, and where you do get these misleading other things. Even the official results are often.
It's terrible.
Yeah, it's very weird.
But I mean, do you think to build on that? You know, if you read in your opinion polls, I think that they're maybe gradually moving away from it, but it's still Labour, Con, Lib Dem. Other. Do you think we need to kind of, when we're approaching politics,
well, I
think the other?
I think all the opinion polls now are showing Ukip as a fourth party. It's only about 10 years too late, but it's very welcome nonetheless. Yeah, and it will have a big impact. I mean, the key issue really for British politics the next year, the fact that will undoubtedly completely determine the general election, is how big is the Ukip vote in the European Parliament election, then how many local seats do they win, and to that extent, because once actually you'll see next week that one of the key things that supports parties is councillors. Councillors are almost the only people who go out and campaign for parties. So if you win councillors, you're beginning to create a party base in particular local areas, and particularly in rural conservative areas last year. We'll see what happens this year. And then how much of the Ukip vote will stay loyal to Ukip in the general election? So in the past, you know, if you go to 2009, the year before the general election, Ukip got 17 and a bit % of the vote, and the BNP got another 7%. So you had a 25% block of far-right voters, most of whom drifted back to the Conservatives and some to Labour in 2010. So actually UKIP's election campaign in 2010 was run by a Lord who was the leader of the party. I've forgotten his name now.
Pearson of Rannoch.
Lord Pearson of Rannoch. When he was asked about his manifesto, he confessed that he hadn't read it. And he was a bit of a chump, basically. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage was trying to unseat the Speaker and managed to crash in a plane and was out of action. So it was amazingly, so they got down from 17%. A year later, they polled 3.5%. Now, the interesting question is, now that Nigel Farage has sort of broken through and he's got name recognition, he's got quite a favourable public rating of him as a sort of guy who talks straight. If you've ever been in a bar with him, he talks incredibly straight. So if they get 27%, say, so they've wrapped up the BNP vote, they've got the far-right vote, and then they reduce. Well, if they reduce to 8%, which is what most political scientists expect, that will be pretty disastrous for the Conservatives. If they hold on to 10 or 11%, it could be, you know, sort of like the split between Labour and the Liberal Democrats in the 1980s under Mrs. Thatcher. And it creates a huge strategic problem for David Cameron, because he's got to, you know, he himself is sort of on the centre-right bit of the Conservative Party, but he's somehow got to appeal to UKIP on the far right. And they are pretty far right. You know, they've got a very strong anti-immigration policy. They have a hugely deflationary public spending policy at the moment, which they may or may not reassess. So it's a very interesting problem for him in many ways. One of the items on the reading list that I'd recommend to you is a blog by me which says the lasting achievement of Mrs. Thatcher was to create, 3 parties on the right instead of just one. So the Liberal Democrats are now a right-wing party, the Conservatives are a right-wing party, Ukip's a right-wing party. There's a lot of fragmentation on the right.
I mean, to go back to the point about UKIP in the opinion polls, I know that the opinion pollsters worried long and hard about breaking UKIP out. And part of the problem, you correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, is that because their polls generally, most national polls have 1,000 people in them, you have to be very, not to get, the risk of more rogue results than you'd normally get, with very small numbers of votes, and this must be a problem actually with the Lib Dem vote, where it's now often under 10%. The chances of getting polls where the sample size is too small for one of these smaller groups is greater. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, so it gets more tricky, and they should really be increasing the sample size.
They should be increasing
the
Right. Okay. Right. Another question? I can hardly see actually for the light. Yes, please. Matthew.
What conditions would we need to see come about for the larger parties at the Westminster level to support a shift in electoral systems?
It's a very good question, and the evidence, from comparative studies is that larger parties will support electoral system change only at the point where they become convinced that not to do so is going to be bad news for them. In other words, larger parties are relentlessly self-interested, and I think that's you'll never underestimate, for example, the duplicity of Labour thinking about electoral reform. It's bizarre and Byzantine, and there's anything like reforming the House of Lords or changing the voting system for Westminster. You can be absolutely sure that 95% of politicians, I think, will behave in a pretty self-interested, ruthlessly self-interested way. So Tony Blair didn't mind innovating in Scotland and Wales and London because, London he thought he was going to win. But, at Scotland and Wales he thought Labour would win outright majorities, and they never did. But these were new systems, and there weren't people in position already, incumbent politicians with futures at stake. So I think also, if you look at the cross-national evidence, when you have a change in the voting rules from plurality rule to proportional representation, it very rarely changes the party system, almost never changes the party system. And the reason it never changes the party system is because the party system has already changed. It's only when the party system has fully and decisively changed that one or other of the top 2 parties bites the bullet and embraces a voting system change. And even then it would have to be a very moderate step-by-step change, I think, in the UK. So AV was a step too far, for Labour, and I think SV would be a lot more tolerable, and that's why SV has been spreading and being adopted. I think at some stage, possibly in the next 5 years, we could see SV adopted for local elections in Britain, and maybe a couple of years later for Westminster elections. But it's got to be a very slow and incremental process, and the parties have got to feel comfortable. Otherwise, they just ruthlessly veto. They don't mind carrying on, pretending to have legitimacy when legitimacy has, to some extent, considerable extent, seeped away.
Isn't a near mathematical answer to this, or a kind of that is that at the moment I'm this party, this party, this party, this party, and this party don't have much in common, but they all, I'm pretty sure, support PR.
Yeah.
I think the BNP and Respect probably both support. I'm just guessing, don't they? I think they do.
Yeah.
Right, they would, wouldn't they? Now, for these 2 parties, certainly in England, so long as their vote is above some number like 24%, they will continue, because of some of the slides you showed earlier, to win a disproportionately large block of the seats. But if either of them fell below a number like 22, 23, they would lose seats very fast to an incumbent, into an insurgent party. And if that happened, presumably one or other of them might well change their view. What about that? What about that for a guess?
I don't see that as happening. And
Okay.
I don't see that as,
So the two-party system's less dead than...
Look, if we go to PR systems around the world, we normally find that there are top two parties that are the biggest parties.
Yeah.
So, PRs doesn't get
No, no.
rid of big parties.
No, I'm just
If we think
answering
about
Matthew's
Germany
question,
or,
though.
or
Yeah.
Italy or whatever, you can have very big parties under a PR system. I think the more interesting thing, when would Labour really begin to feel threatened, for example, and threatened enough that it would feel the need to go for a proportional thing? Well, there is one proposal floating around at the moment, put forward by the very ingenious Oliver Letwin and Danny Alexander, which is called the fourth reading proposal. And this copes with the traditional West Lothian question of why should voters in Britain have Scottish and Welsh MPs voting on matters to do with them, by proposing to add a new fourth reading stage to any England-only bill. And this fourth reading stage would be a yes-no vote stage for which only English MPs would be entitled to vote. So you'd process legislation through Parliament, through the customary three readings, in the normal way at the moment. Labour, if it was in power, would have Scottish and Welsh MPs as part of its majority during that legislation formation process. But then there would be this, do you want to accept this law or not? And only the English MPs would vote. Labour has not had a majority of English MPs since ever, is very unlikely ever to have a majority of English MPs, and this proposal would be the kind of possible terminal kind of threat which might persuade the party to change their minds. So I think if, for example, we had a Conservative outright government that implemented this proposal, or a Conservative Lib Dem coalition Mark II that implemented this proposal, that would be a very serious existential threat to the Labour Party's capabilities to be a governing party, at which point it would give up on the dream of sole power and think about protecting its seat share a lot more and minimising the, because Labour, for example, racks up hundreds of thousands of votes in the southeast of England and gets no seats for it. Their best bet, if the fourth reading or anything like it, English Parliament or anything like that, was ever to make progress, would be to shift immediately to PR. Otherwise, they'd be in a
Because at that time,
tied into nothing.
the fourth reading debate would stop it, wouldn't it? At the point they decided it was in their best interests.
No, because you could it would be UK legislation.
That would be UK legislation. Okay, fair point. Excellent. Okay, a great point to this, of course, begs a question we bumped into last week about the question of the window of opportunity for English lawmakers who are English MPs in the period after the Scottish referendum, if the Scots vote to stay in the United Kingdom, because that creates an interesting window of possibility which is not available to English lawmakers between up to the point of that referendum. Anyway, I'd just like to thank Pat Dunleavy for an excellent and hugely information-filled lecture. We'll see you back here this time next week. Thank you all, and thank you, Patrick.